Hello, welcome to the presentation. My name is Patrick Rainsbury, Senior Product Manager, Developer Advocate for the Fusion 360 platform. This presentation is going to give a little update on a lot of the enhancements that were made to the Fusion 360 API in 2021. So with that, let's get started. Okay, first I just wanted to call attention again to this change that's coming in the next major version of Fusion 360, which will be in March 2022, the end of March some point. Fusion's upgrading its Python from 3.7 to 3.9, and for most Python add-ins or scripts, this won't have an impact. 3.7 should be completely compatible. The only issue is if you do distribute an add-in of some kind, either internally at your company or distributing it obviously to your customers, since this is ADN. If you distribute your app as PyCs, we've been trying to reach out to anybody we know is doing that. There's a post on the forums. Definitely check it out. It's a sticky post on the forum that has a lot more detailed information. But so if you do distribute an add-in that only has compiled Python in it and it was compiled in 3.7, there's some things that you need to do. You just need to get a new version out there when the new Fusion comes out that is compiled to Python 3.9. Other than that, nobody should see really any impact, except for the fact that you can now use all the things that are new in 3.8 and 3.9. Another kind of update notice is just that initially in Fusion 360 there was the embedded palettes. We're using some older browser technology. Couple of years ago, I think it's been even now, where we introduced an option when you create a palette called Use New Web Browser, and this is the web browser that pretty much any other commands in Fusion are using. It's just a more current version of Chromium. We've had this option in there for a long time. In some future release, it'll probably still be quite a while before we fully deprecate the old ones. If you're for some reason using some kind of older web technology that isn't compatible with newer Chromium, which is kind of hard to believe. But if you're in that situation, you could still theoretically rely on the old WebKit or something, and you can still, we'll give you plenty of notice before those are actually deprecated and taken out. But just as part of that, we'll just be introducing a new add to on the palettes object to be able to just have a cleaner way to add a palette, doing things like setting width and height after the fact, since most of the time setting those doesn't even really do anything, because once a user's resized the window, it's going to stick anyways. And then obviously removing the option for use new browser. So you can start using this add to. This is actually something I believe is coming not until the March update, but figured I'd just put it in here. This will be just an easier way to add palettes in the future. And again, the method will be supported for the old way after even WebKit's no longer available. It's just that the use new browser option will do nothing. So just wanted to make you guys aware of that one. So one of the things over the last year is we've added a bunch of new samples. This is just something, tons of new samples just scattered throughout the help, just lots of little small samples. And then in the most recent update, you'll see 2 new samples in the actual add-ins dialog box that are leveraging the new template that I'll talk about in a minute. But there's also a couple of new samples on the Fusion 360 GitHub page that are also implementations of this template. And you can see some of the commands here in the new command sample that are just showing different ways of using all of the different command inputs, but also showing you how to leverage this new template. And with that, so one of the, probably my favorite enhancement really over the last year is the introduction of a new add-in template. So now when you go to create a new add-in in Python, you will see that previously you would just get a couple of just an empty file basically that didn't really do anything, and there was quite a steep learning curve for some people to be able to get set up with the event handlers and things like that that you had to do, and just how to even structure an add-in properly. So we spent a lot of time putting this together, and it kind of inspired by things like Create React App or things like that if you've used. And the idea is to just really give you kind of an entire application structure and layout and kind of some best practices on a format, as well as you'll see in this lib folder, Fusion 360 Utils is got some helper utilities that will really kind of streamline the process of creating commands. So if you're, kind of standard thing to just put a button in the UI, then you want to have a dialog pop up, take some inputs, do something with those inputs. And so this is really kind of geared towards that workflow. This is another feature I just really like. Sometimes it's just the little things. It's just a new logging function that allows you to log to the text commands palette. So you can just kind of have like more of like a console type logging without having to use message boxes. If you start to use the new template and the new utilities library that we put together, you'll see extensive usage of logging over message box. And it also allows you to set the log type, and you can actually then log directly to the Fusion 360 application logs, which, if you were trying to figure something out, or you're trying to get some kind of errors submitted into support or something like that, you could be actually having your app logged directly to the Fusion app logs. But for the most part, especially during development, it's so convenient to be able to be just constantly printing things out to the text commands palette window. And you'll also see this the same kind of console feedback here also comes out in the VS Code console if you're actively debugging, which is also very nice. Kind of a small one, but very convenient. It was added last year. Is just if you go into Fusion Preferences in API, there's now just a toggle to turn on developer tools, and the developer tools in this case is referring to the Chromium developer tools. So if you are developing something that is in a palette and you want to have that right-click menu that allows you to say launch DevTools, you can turn that on, and then you can launch DevTools to actually do debugging on any HTML and JavaScript. It also lets you just do things like back, forward, reload, save page, view source, standard things like that. But you used to be able to always enable this. If you read this in the documentation, you used to be able to enable this through a text command, and I can never remember what the text command was. So it's very nice to have this in a toggle now. Okay, actually, this is my favorite enhancement from last year. It's HTML command input. And so, before you could use a palette to create an HTML interface, but those palettes were not really commands. They were kind of a non-modal interface. So you could have a palette up at any point, but you kind of had to do some trickery if you were trying to use it to actually do things like create geometry or use it like a command. So now you can actually do is just a regular command input, like a selection input or a text input or whatever, is an HTML input. And so what that does is it basically places a Chromium frame inside the command dialog. So you have a proper command with preview, execute, created, except in the middle of the command dialog itself, you can have an HTML page. And so in this example, you're just seeing a little HTML page, and the interaction is the same. So if you've used palettes before and you set up HTML event handlers, you can basically having JavaScript running in the Chromium frame, that you can send messages out to the actual Python or C++ add-in that's running to interact with it that way, and vice versa. You can send messages into the palette, into the HTML command input, just like you would to a palette. So the interaction pattern is the same. It's just that you're going to set those handlers up on the command itself rather than on the global application object. So you should read that if you're interested in this. The documentation is great. There's also in the new sample, in the command sample, one of the sample commands in there is this one that you're seeing here, which just has some basic information. It just sets up a couple of basic inputs, but like, for example, a selection input, which was really hard to do with palettes before, was deal with selections. So you could select something, and then you'll see as soon as something's selected, the JavaScript in this HTML page is being updated to show what was selected. So it's a nice little example, and I think it really sets the stage for all of the amazing things that you guys can do by having web pages embedded in these command inputs. It's kind of a small one, but heavily requested by those who wanted it, which is that when you get the occurrences, a list of the occurrences in an assembly or as the children of a component, you never really knew what order they were going to come in. And if you were trying to build some kind of an interface that was matching up with the UI, it was very difficult to sort of figure out the order or figure out which one uh, corresponded to which occurrence in the actual browser tree. So now when you ask for the occurrences as an array, you can be guaranteed that the array will be sorted in the order that they appear in the browser. So again, like you can see here in this sample code, if you kind of follow this, this is just a kind of a simple little assembly traversal script, but it will, when you get these occurrences of each child, you will be getting them in the exact order that they appear in the browser, which is very convenient and very highly requested by those of you who wanted that. So there you go. So here's just a few other little ones, but just where new functionality was added to existing commands. So just some of the things like ruled surface has corner type. Extrude added the ability to do what's essentially a thin extrude, so you give a thickness to the profile. So the API supports that now. Sketch chamfer has now support in the API, and then in fillet and chamfer there was some new options that were added, and those are now also in the API. So again, just kind of rounding out some of the API support for existing features. A number of objects in the CAM API now support attributes. So attributes is a really great way to keep track of information if your add-in is in some way interacting with data in a user's file, to be able to store properties or even complex data structures as JSON strings or whatever. You can tag things all over a user's file with attributes. Now in the CAM environment as well, on folders, patterns, operations, and setups, you can add attributes. So last year we added file export support for 3MF, which is a popular format in manufacturing, particularly in additive manufacturing. You can learn more at the 3MF website. And then USDZ export. This is actually coming in a few weeks in the March update, month or so, but I just figured I'd throw it in here because it's pretty fun. USDZ file format, particularly interesting if you are trying to do something with Apple's Reality Kit and their mobile AR stuff. USDZ is the preferred format, which is a format that was introduced by Pixar, and it is open source, and you can learn more at some of the links in the presentation if you download it. Okay, this is something that was updated that has a huge impact on performance. If you had previously tried to do things like maybe create a drop-down menu that listed all of the projects in a user's hub, and they had a lot of projects or all the files in a folder or whatever, the data APIs could get very slow. I won't go into all the details of why, but in general, just using the regular collections, so say data projects, the performance of those standard collections has been improved significantly. But there's a new method called asArray, which you're starting to see in a lot more places. Whereas, without going into all the details of the collections concept, between the different, it's used all over the place, right? But if you use something like data projects.asArray, you are essentially only hitting the API once, and you're just getting the full list populated into just a straight array. So in Python, it'd just be as a list. And then now that list object is incredibly fast to iterate, instantaneous. Whereas like before, to even just run this little script right here could have taken quite some time in a large hub. Now it would just be instantaneous. So this is a small thing, but using this, just remembering to use this asArray method when you're going to do something that's going to be iterated will improve the performance of your add-ins and scripts significantly. Okay, this is another one that's been a pretty big request to do something around, which is that when you initially save a document in Fusion 360, you essentially have kind of something that only exists in your local environment. And then when you save it, it in the background is obviously syncing it to Fusion 360's cloud data. And there's a delay between when the user hits save and when the actual cloud data object is ready. And that's what in the API we represent with the data file object. And so, for example, if you wanted to, whenever a user saves a document, you were trying to get the data file to get the ID so that you could save it off in some other external data store, or you wanted to do things like enable public sharing, or really anything else that has to do with interacting with the cloud data model, you needed to wait until the data file was ready. And there was not a great way to do that other than basically just setting up something that would just poll. Given a document after it's been saved, you just kind of had to poll and wait. And so now there's a new event that's introduced on the application object called data file complete. And that, if you're subscribed to that event, the event will be fired every time a data file is ready. And so then you can check it against, whatever document you were maybe looking for. But, this is particularly useful in the case where you might be doing something where an add-in might be, say, importing an entire directory of step files or something along those lines. And basically, as each data file becomes available, then you're going to keep getting hit with that event, and then you can process the data files to do whatever you need to do, like extract the IDs or turn on sharing or whatever it is. Along with that, you can also do things like get this object here's got this data or document. The creation ID just gives you some sort of unique identifier in this case before a file saved. So once a file saved and synced for the first time, you have the data file ID, but before that, you can now have this creation ID. And then there's also a Boolean check on a data file to see if it's complete, which is even in the case of users saving future versions, there's still this lag between if they save v3 until v4 is ready on the cloud, there might be a 20-second, 40-second delay until it's fully accessible through the local desktop API. So you can do a quick check there. And then there's also this option to do data file refresh. In 99% of the cases, you shouldn't have to do that. In the case where maybe the user was in a situation where they were doing something and they were having there was some concurrent editing going on or something like that, maybe I could see it. But for the most part, you shouldn't need it. But what it will do is it'll trigger a full refresh of the local state of the documents in Fusion and to make sure that they are all latest. And so the big improvement here is this event for the data file complete. And you can see in the documentation there's some more comprehensive example of how to implement and set it up. And there's also a pretty nice sample that been working on that should be on the GitHub site relatively soon. That is more of a how to do these bulk import workflows and leverage that data file complete event. Okay, here's another one related to handling data and dealing with Fusion's cloud data. So in Fusion 360, you can always save any files you want into Fusion Team or just Fusion 360's cloud data environment through the user interface. But through the API, there wasn't really a logical way to just quickly download it. You almost had to end up going through like Forge Data Management or something like that outside of your add-in, because every file that's in Fusion would have a data file associated with it. So every item in a user's project or folder has a data file. It's just that the only ones that you really could logically open before were Fusion design files or Fusion drawing files or something where it's going to actually open in application. So now what you can do is, like, if you wanted to say store some sort of a settings file, I've had people ask where they want to have kind of a global settings file for all of the users in a company for their app and put it in the Fusion Team Hub somewhere. And so now what you can do is you could always upload the file, but now you can download the file. So you can just basically, if you have the identifier to it, so whether you've saved the version, the URN, like the version ID or lineage ID, you could get to it that way, or you could just traverse looking for it by name if you knew where it was in what project or folder. But then now you can just say file download. And there's two ways of doing it. So the first way is synchronous. So if you just give it the data file.download, give it a path. Like usually, I would assume you're probably just going to throw it in some temp folder and then go act on it in whatever way. If you just, for the second argument, if you pass none, it'll basically, the application will just block until it's downloaded. And then if you want to do it a little bit more elegantly, you can actually set up a download handler and then pass that in to the download operation, and then you'll get the download handler will get the callback once the download's done. Especially important if you can, I could imagine if you're building something where instead of just some simple configuration file, what you're really trying to do is store, say, some large data set, like maybe it's simulation results or some other large set of data. You want to put it in the user's project and then be able to access it through your app if the user was logged into a different computer or a different user in the same company wants to access that data. Obviously for a big download, you don't want to block them from Fusion while they're downloading the file. So here you can just basically, your app will get the callback when the download's done, and then you could do whatever you need to do to edit or append it. And then in both cases, of course, in the settings case, if you wanted to edit, if your app edits the settings, you could always use the regular upload new version function. So just kind of summarize that workflow, the workflow for creating kind of a settings file that would be used across some customer of yours entire company environment. Basically just have your add-in initially create some kind of a settings file, right? JSON, XML type thing, whatever makes sense to you. Then you would use the data folder upload file initially that would give you a new, what we call lineage, or a new data file, right? With a new ID, store it somewhere, somehow, or know that it's in a common location. Then on any other computer that's using your add-in, by whatever means you have, whether you have the user just browse to it once and then you store that somewhere locally on their computer, just the location of the settings file, right? Then data find file by ID to get it. And then you can use the data file.download now to download that settings file. And then also you could do, using these same functions, you could do things like check to see as any user in the company was using your add-in. You could be looking at that common settings file to see if there was a new version and all of the kind of normal things you can do. And that's the advantage of this, is being able to leverage the infrastructure of the Fusion 360 data environment, Fusion team, to be able to make sure that everybody has kind of the same version of your, even if it's just some basic settings or configuration of your add-in. And then when a user changes your settings, or if there's an admin that's changing it, then you could have your add-in still upload the new version of it. So rather than having to create a whole new file lineage or anything, if you get a reference to that original off of the data file object, there's an option to upload new version, which means that now you just have, say, the version 2 of your configuration file. And with that, thank you guys very much. I really appreciate it. This is always really fun to do these DevDays presentations. I wish we could be doing this live, but I'll take it. Look forward to following up with a Q&A session, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the sessions. Thanks again.